Welcome to the Fun Astrology and Merriman Market Analyst Saturday Financial Podcast. I'm Thomas Miller. Thanks for joining us. Obviously, a crazy week in the markets, and this week's MMAcycles.com newsletter is written by Wyatt Fellows. Wyatt is the editor of the monthly MMA Grain Report, which was issued this week and covers corn, wheat, and soybeans. He also is the lead MMA analyst, along with Ray Merriman, for the MMA weekly and monthly updates for the gold market. And following this newsletter on the Fun Astrology podcast, I'm going to have some extra thoughts of my own from looking at some of the charts this week. Ray will return to write next week's column on April 11th. He was scheduled to do this week's column, but instead he is preparing for a special webinar on Sunday, this Sunday, April 6th, a micro webinar and call entitled What the Bleep is Happening Part 2. That will be at 1 p.m. Eastern on Sunday. Information is at MMAcycles.com inside this week's free weekly comments. All that said, let's roll. And first, a quote from Dr. Paul Donovan from the UBS Morning Comment on April 4th. He said, financial markets expected a significant tax increase from U.S. President Trump. Yesterday's reaction shows the tax increase was worse than anticipated. U.S. dollar weakness is telling. We often hear that when the United States sneezes, the global economy catches cold. But this is not the U.S. sneezing. This is the U.S. cutting its own arm off. The self-inflicted economic cost naturally weakens the dollar. For now, the U.S. recession risks have risen. End quote. And now Wyatt's comments to start the week in review. He said there's no delicate way to say it. Last week was an utter bloodbath. Almost nothing was spared as traders and governments came to grips with the potential implications of the Trump tariff plan. Stock markets around the world sold off sharply, and the Nasdaq got hit particularly hard. This week's sell-off has it down over 21% from its February high. Gold tried to hang in there, but eventually it fell almost $170 from its early week highs. Silver fared much worse, experiencing a $6 move lower from Wednesday's intraday high to Friday's low. This has now taken silver back below $30 an ounce for the first time since the beginning of the year. It wasn't much better for commodities either. Crude oil plunged almost $12 a barrel from Wednesday's high to a low of $60.45 on Friday. This is now below the May 2023 low, which raises some very bearish concerns moving forward. If you name any commodity, it probably was lower on the week. Even the unrelenting bull market in live cattle, pun definitely intended, showed some cracks by finishing limit down on Friday. However, there was one shining beacon of hope, and that was the corn market. Against the backdrop of the market mayhem, corn finished the week with a modest 3-cent gain. Don't laugh after a week like this. A win is a win. In other markets, bonds seemed to catch a little bit of that old-school flight to safety bid and finished the week strong. Bitcoin held up reasonably well, finishing almost unchanged for the week. The dollar sold off sharply Wednesday and Thursday, but recouped some of those losses with a strong reversal on Friday. The most interesting currency was probably the Australian dollar, which plunged almost 5% on Friday alone. This is a massive one-day move for a major currency. Now, the short-term geocosmics. Here's a quote from Eric Ravel, What to Know About President Trump's Liberation Day Tariffs from CNBC.com. He says, April 2nd, 2025 will forever be remembered as the day American industry was reborn, according to Donald Trump in his remarks from the Rose Garden. This is one of the most important days, in my opinion, in American history, he said. It is our declaration of economic independence. But now it is our turn to prosper, and in so doing, use trillions of dollars to reduce our taxes and pay down our national debt, and it will all happen very quickly, end quote. And how it's going, from the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal on Thursday, President Trump said there would be a little disturbance from his tariffs. But how does he define little? Congress has circumscribed the president's power to impose tariffs, allowing it on imports that threaten national security, Section 232, or in response to, quote, large and serious, end quote, balance of payment deficits, Section 122, a surge of imports that harms U.S. industry, Section 201, and discriminatory trade practices, 301. None of these trade provisions empowers Mr. Trump to impose tariffs on all imports from all countries based on an arbitrary formula. Section 122 lets a president impose tariffs of up to 15% in response to trade deficits, but Congress must approve them after 150 days. Someone should sue to block this abuse of power. End quote. Now, Wyatt's comments on the short-term geocosmics. He says, when Ray first used the term retrograde chaos to describe this period from December 6, 2024 to April 12, 2025, a period of time when all three personal planets were in retrograde motion, he sure wasn't kidding. The newly elected leadership of the United States seems to be taking on less of a leadership role on the global stage. This has undoubtedly caused confusion and uncertainty for parts of the world, forcing countries into action to fill this newly created void. Now, with the implementation of Trump's tariff policy, there truly seems to be a sense of chaos with the natural order of things, or at least with how things were once thought to be. Alliances seem to be breaking down. Global trade is breaking down. Financial markets are melting down. It truly is a chaotic time. But now we find ourselves closer to the end of this chaotic retrograde period than at the beginning. Mercury will be returning to direct motion on April 7th, with Venus set to turn back direct on April 12th. It's never wise to start something or implement a new strategy during a retrograde period like this. Trump really could use an astrologer on his team. It wouldn't shock me to see lawsuits filed against the Trump administration, as stated in the editorial quote previously. We may even see the repeal of some or all of Trump's tariffs in the not-too-distant future because of it. In this case, one would hope that there isn't too much damage already done. As for the markets, we'll be watching this period, April 7th through the 12th, for potential sharp reversals. Something similar happened between Mars turning direct on February 23rd and Venus stationing retrograde on March 1st. Many markets bottomed during this time and produced healthy rallies. Ray will be covering these possibilities in this weekend's webinar. And now the longer-term thoughts. Wyatt continues. In a previous column that I was asked to author, I mentioned the upcoming Saturn-Neptune conjunction and its correlation to droughts over major grain-producing regions of the world, the U.S., Russia, Ukraine, Australia, etc. The study I presented at the MMA Investment Retreat in Lake Bled, Slovenia, was particularly focused on the wheat market, but it can possibly be extrapolated into other consumable agricultural commodities such as corn, soybeans, cotton, etc. as well. My findings were that during the Saturn-Neptune conjunctions and oppositions, a supply-reducing drought occurred over a major wheat-producing area of the world within a reasonable amount of time surrounding the aspect. Because of this, the price of wheat would embark on a robust rally, usually topping out 0 to 2 years later. The correlation goes back to the 1800s, but let's start at the 1930s. Saturn and Neptune formed 3 oppositions between 1936 and 37. This was during the Dust Bowl, in which successive drought years decimated crops in the United States. The wheat price hit a high in 1937. Saturn then formed 3 conjunctions with Neptune between 1952 and 53. Similar to the 1930s, this was a time of successive drought in the United States that led to a top in wheat in 1955. The Saturn-Neptune oppositions that formed in 1971 and 72 were different in the fact that drought had took hold over the Soviet Union at that time. This drought was particularly bad and forced the Soviet Union to hit the world market, where it bought up all the grain reserves it could find. This would later become known as the Great Grain Robbery. As a direct result, wheat prices spiked violently, topping in 1974. In 1989, the Saturn-Neptune conjunctions correlated with the 1988 U.S. drought, which was the worst since the 1930s. That led to a top in wheat prices early in 1989. The most recent Saturn-Neptune oppositions occurred during 2006 and 7. Whilst not a severe drought, enough areas were impacted by lack of rainfall to bring overall yields down. This was also during the time when the commodity bubble was in full swing before being pricked by the great financial crisis. Wheat then hit an all-time high in 2008. The next Saturn-Neptune conjunction takes place in February of 2026. While it only transpires as a single pass this time around, it should be noted that the two planets will come to within a degree of exactness this year, 2025, from June through August. What's also interesting about this coming conjunction is that it takes place with both planets positioned at 1 degree of fiery Aries. Does this fact add to the possibility of another drought developing over a major grain hub? Or does this mean the supply of wheat, food, could be impacted in some other way, perhaps by an escalation of war or a perceived threat to food security? The answers to these questions will all come in time. All we can do now is to be aware of possible outcomes. With wheat and other grain and ag markets near multi-year lows, it might not be a bad idea to add those markets to your quote page, even if it's at the very bottom. As Saturn and Neptune do their dance in the sky, those markets might just make it to the top of your list in a few years. And those are Wyatt's thoughts for this week, and obviously we will probably all be on the call with Ray on Sunday. We should be. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great week, everybody. We'll see you back on the Fun Astrology Podcast on Monday.